Who got you this necklace? The question didn't just cut through the room, it silenced it. The clink of crystal glasses stopped mid-air, conversations dissolved into unfinished sentences, and every head in the restaurant turned toward the center table where Adrian Voss stood, perfectly still, his hand hovering just inches from the delicate chain resting against the waitress's collarbone. The lighting in the room was warm, golden, reflecting off polished mahogany and marble floors, but somehow it felt colder now, as if the air itself had tightened under the weight of his voice. Lena Brooks didn't move. Not immediately. Her fingers, slender and steady just moments ago while pouring a 12-ounce glass of Napa Valley Red, now curled slightly against the tray she held, knuckles pale beneath her dark skin. She had learned, in places like this, that survival often meant silence. And Adrian Voss was not a man anyone ignored. He wasn't just another wealthy guest. He was the kind of man whose presence bent the atmosphere around him, whose quiet carried more authority than raised voices ever could. 6'3", broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Lena made in 3 months, he didn't need to repeat himself. The question lingered, heavy and deliberate. Who got you this necklace? Not what. Who? Because men like Adrian didn't see objects, they saw ownership, intent, territory. Lena finally looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time that night. There was no fear in them. That, more than anything, made something shift inside him. Because fear was what he expected. Fear was what the rest of the room was already feeling. The manager near the bar had frozen mid-step, unsure whether to intervene or disappear. A couple seated nearby exchanged uneasy glances, their whispered conversation dissolving into silence. Even the pianist in the corner hesitated, fingers hovering above ivory keys before slowly lowering them without playing a note. The room went still. Adrian's gaze dropped again, drawn, almost against his will, to the necklace. It wasn't expensive. That was obvious at a glance. No diamonds catching the light, no designer signature. Just a simple chain, slightly worn, with a small pendant that had been polished so many times it held a quiet, stubborn shine. And yet, it didn't belong here. Not in a place where everything screamed excess and perfection. Not on someone who carried herself like she was trying to disappear. Lena swallowed, barely noticeable, her hand instinctively rising to touch the pendant, fingertips brushing it like it was something more than metal. Something personal. Adrian noticed that too. He noticed everything. The way her breath slowed instead of quickened. The way she didn't step back. The way she didn't answer. And for a reason he couldn't immediately name, that silence irritated him more than any defiance could have. He leaned in slightly, not enough to invade, but enough that his voice no longer needed volume. I asked you something. Low. Controlled. But no longer calm. Around them, the tension stretched thin, like glass about to crack. Lena's eyes flickered for just a second, not away from him, but inward, as if something behind that simple necklace had just been pulled to the surface. And in that moment, Adrian Voss realized something he hadn't expected. This wasn't about the necklace anymore. It was about why he couldn't look away. Adrian did not step back, and that alone told everyone watching that whatever this was, it was not over. Lena lowered her hand slowly from the necklace, her fingers lingering for just a fraction of a second longer than necessary, as if letting go required effort. The tray in her other hand remained perfectly balanced, a quiet defiance in the steadiness of her posture. She had been working in places like this long enough to understand men with money, men with power, men who believed that every answer belonged to them simply because they asked the question. But Adrian Voss was different, and that difference was exactly what made this moment dangerous. Not because he was loud, or unpredictable, but because he was controlled. And control, when it cracked, did not make noise. It made silence. The manager finally found the courage to move, taking 2 careful steps forward, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor. Sir, is there a problem? He asked, voice tight, carefully neutral. Adrian did not look at him. He did not acknowledge him at all. His attention remained fixed on Lena, as if the rest of the room had faded into something irrelevant. That was when the manager stopped. Because there are moments when people understand, instinctively, that stepping further would only make things worse. Lena exhaled softly, a breath so controlled it almost did not exist, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. It was a gift. The words were simple, but they did not answer the question. Adrian's jaw tightened, just slightly, the kind of movement most people would miss. But those who knew him would recognize it as a shift. A line being drawn. From who? He asked again, slower this time, each word deliberate, as if he were giving her another chance to say it right. Around them, the tension shifted from curiosity to something heavier. This was no longer a passing moment. This was something personal. Lena's gaze did not waver, but there was something new behind her eyes now. Not fear. Not defiance. Something deeper. Something that did not belong in a place like this. Does it matter? She asked, and the question landed softer than his, but it carried weight in a different way. It was not challenging him. It was challenging the reason behind the question itself. Adrian inhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man takes when he realizes he has stepped into something he did not plan. Because she was right. It should not have mattered. A waitress wearing a simple necklace should not have been something that pulled his focus, disrupted his evening, or made him forget the conversation he had been having seconds before. And yet, here he was. Standing. Asking. Watching her like the answer held more than it should. His hand dropped to his side, but he did not move away. Not yet. Everything matters, he said finally, his voice lower now, less sharp but no less intense. Lena studied him for a moment, as if deciding something, and then she gave a small nod, almost to herself. Not agreement. Acceptance. The kind that comes when someone realizes a moment cannot be avoided. Slowly, she set the tray down on the nearest table, the soft sound of glass touching wood echoing louder than it should have in the quiet room. Then she looked back at him, fully now, shoulders straight, chin lifted just enough to show she was no longer trying to disappear. It was my father's, she said. And just like that, the air changed. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But something inside Adrian Voss shifted in a way he could not immediately explain. Because whatever answer he had expected, it was not that. For a brief moment, no one spoke, and in that silence, Lena's words seemed to settle into the room like something heavier than sound. Adrian did not react the way anyone expected. He did not scoff, did not dismiss it, did not step away as if the answer had closed the conversation. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, his gaze still fixed on her, but now there was something different in it. Not anger. Not quite curiosity either. Something quieter. Something unsettled. Your father, he repeated, slower this time, as if testing the weight of the words. Lena gave a small nod, her hand once again brushing lightly against the pendant, but this time the gesture was not defensive. It was grounding. He gave it to me when I was 16, she said, her voice steady, though softer now, as if the room had narrowed to just the two of them. He said it was not worth much. But that it meant something. Adrian's eyes flickered briefly to the necklace again, noticing details he had missed before. The chain was slightly worn near the clasp, the metal dulled in places where it had been handled too often, too carefully. The pendant itself was simple, but there was a faint engraving along the back, nearly invisible unless the light hit it just right. He had seen expensive jewelry his entire life. This was not that. And yet, it carried something more difficult to measure. And you never take it off, he said, not as a question, but as an observation. Lena shook her head once. No, the answer was immediate. Certain. That certainty lingered between them, and Adrian found himself holding onto it longer than he should have. Around them, the restaurant remained suspended in a strange, quiet tension. People were watching, though most tried not to make it obvious. The manager had retreated, but not far, hovering just enough to intervene if necessary, though even he seemed unsure what intervention would look like now. This was no longer a confrontation anyone understood. Adrian straightened slightly, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly, as if recalibrating. For a man who controlled every room he entered, this one had begun to feel unfamiliar. Not because of chaos, but because of something far more subtle. A loss of certainty. What did he do? Adrian asked, and this time his voice carried less edge, more intent. Lena blinked, clearly not expecting the question to move in that direction. For a second, she hesitated, as if deciding whether to answer at all. Then she spoke. He worked construction, she said. Long hours. Early mornings. The kind of job where people do not notice you unless something goes wrong. Adrian listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, but his attention absolute. Lena continued, her voice gaining a quiet strength as she spoke. He used to say that most people spend their lives being overlooked. That it does not mean they are not important. It just means no one is paying attention. Her fingers tightened slightly around the pendant. This was his way of reminding me not to forget where I come from. The words settled into Adrian in a way he did not expect. Because he understood being noticed. He understood power, presence, influence. But being overlooked, that was a language he had not spoken in a long time. And yet, something about the way she said it made it feel familiar. Uncomfortably so. He exhaled slowly, his gaze softening just enough that it no longer felt like pressure. And he is not here anymore, Adrian said quietly. It was not really a question. Lena shook her head again, this time more subtly. No, just one word. No explanation. No elaboration. But it was enough. Adrian looked at her for a long moment after that, longer than was appropriate, longer than made sense in a room full of people waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. No dramatic shift. No sudden resolution. Just a quiet, growing awareness that whatever this moment was, it had already changed something. And neither of them could step back to where they had been before. The silence did not break, but it changed shape, stretching into something more fragile, more uncertain, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for a reaction that did not come. Adrian shifted his weight slightly, the movement subtle but deliberate, and for the first time since he had stood up, he took a step back. Not far. Just enough to create space between them. It was a small gesture, almost invisible to anyone not watching closely, but Lena noticed. Her shoulders eased, just a fraction, though she did not move away. She remained where she was, grounded, steady, her presence no longer trying to shrink beneath the weight of the room. Adrian's gaze drifted once more to the necklace, but this time it lingered on the faint engraving along the back of the pendant. Something about it felt familiar, though he could not immediately place why. He leaned slightly to the side, catching the light at a different angle, and for a brief second, the tiny inscription became clearer. Not a name. Not exactly. Just a few letters. Worn. Almost erased by time. His brow tightened. What does it say? He asked quietly. Lena hesitated again, but this time the pause was different. Not defensive. Reflective. As if she had not expected anyone to ask that question. Slowly, she reached up and turned the pendant slightly so the light caught it more clearly. It is just initials, she said. Nothing important to anyone else. Adrian did not respond right away. He studied the engraving, his mind working through something he could not yet fully grasp. Because those letters, faint as they were, stirred something at the edge of memory. Something distant. Something unfinished. Around them, the tension in the room began to shift again, though no one spoke. A server quietly guided another table away from the center, giving space without drawing attention. Glasses were set down more carefully now. Movements softened. The world continued, but only at the edges. Lena lowered the pendant again, letting it rest against her skin, her fingers brushing over it once more before falling back to her side. "It does not look like much," she added softly. "But he wore it every day before he gave it to me." Adrian's jaw tightened slightly at that. Not out of irritation this time, but recognition. The idea of something worn daily. Something carried without explanation. He understood that. More than he wanted to admit. "And he just gave it to you," Adrian said, his voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. Lena nodded. "On my birthday." No speech. No big moment. Just, handed it to me and said to keep it safe. A faint, almost invisible smile touched her lips. That was how he was. Adrian exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for a brief second, breaking eye contact for the first time since this had begun. That alone shifted something in the room. Because men like Adrian Voss did not look away. Not unless something had changed. And something had. He lifted his eyes again, but the intensity had softened, replaced by something more measured, more internal. "What was his name?" he asked. The question came without force this time. No demand. Just quiet intent. Lena held his gaze for a moment longer, as if weighing the answer, as if deciding whether this was still a conversation she could control. Then she spoke. Marcus Brooks. The name settled between them, simple and unadorned. But to Adrian, it did not feel simple at all. Something in his expression shifted again, more subtly this time, but enough that if anyone had been close enough, they would have seen it. Not recognition. Not yet. But something close. A thread pulling tight. His fingers curled slightly at his side, a habit he had when something demanded his attention in a way he could not immediately resolve. "Marcus," he repeated under his breath, the sound almost lost in the quiet of the room. Lena watched him carefully now, no longer just reacting, but observing. Because whatever had been happening before, this was different. The question about the necklace had turned into something else entirely. Something deeper. Something neither of them had planned. And in that moment, with the soft glow of the restaurant lights reflecting off polished surfaces and held breath lingering in the air, it became clear that this conversation was no longer about curiosity or control. It was about connection. Unwanted. Unexplained. But undeniable. The name did not leave Adrian the way other names did. It did not pass through him and disappear. It stayed. It lingered somewhere deeper, as if it had found a place it recognized before his mind could catch up. Marcus Brooks. He repeated it again in silence, not because he needed to remember it, but because something inside him refused to let it go. Lena noticed the shift immediately. It was subtle, but undeniable. The man who had been standing in front of her moments ago, sharp and controlled, now seemed distracted. Not weak. Not uncertain. But pulled inward, as if something far beyond this restaurant had suddenly demanded his attention. "Do you know him?" she asked quietly, the question leaving her before she could stop it. Adrian did not answer right away. His gaze had drifted past her now, not looking at the room, not looking at anything specific, but somewhere in between, where memory begins to take shape. The restaurant lights reflected faintly in his eyes, but behind them, something else was moving. Slowly, he shook his head once. "No," he said, but the word did not carry conviction. It was the kind of answer given when the truth had not fully surfaced yet. Lena studied him more closely now, her instincts shifting. This was no longer a man interrogating her. This was a man searching for something he did not expect to find. She tilted her head slightly, her voice softer now, almost careful. "He used to say names do not matter unless someone remembers them." Adrian's eyes snapped back to hers at that, sharper this time, as if the sentence had struck something precise. A memory flickered. Not clear. Not complete. Just a fragment. A voice. A moment. A man standing under harsh light, saying something almost identical. Adrian inhaled slowly, the air catching just enough to reveal the crack in his composure. His hand moved unconsciously, fingers brushing against his own cufflink, a habit he had when something unsettled him. The room around them remained quiet, but it was no longer tense in the same way. It had shifted into something more intimate, as if the space itself had narrowed, focusing only on the two of them. "What else did he say?" Adrian asked, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge. Lena hesitated, her fingers once again finding the pendant, holding it this time instead of just brushing it. "He said people do not always get to choose the moment they change someone's life," she replied slowly. "Sometimes they do not even know they did." The words landed heavier than either of them expected. Adrian's expression stilled completely. Not hardened. Not softened. Just, still. Because something in that sentence aligned too closely with the fragments in his mind. A night he did not talk about. A moment he had buried under years of control and distance. A figure he had never been able to fully recall. Until now. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition that was just beginning to surface. "And he told you that when he gave you this?" Adrian asked. Lena shook her head. "No," she said. "He told me that long before." A pause followed, quieter than anything before it. Not empty. Just full of something neither of them had words for yet. Adrian's gaze dropped once more to the necklace, but this time it was not just observation. It was connection. A thread forming between past and present, between a man he could not fully remember and a woman standing in front of him now. And for the first time since this began, Adrian Voss did not feel like the one in control of the moment. He felt like he was stepping into something that had already been set in motion long before he ever asked that first question. Adrian did not speak immediately, and that silence carried more weight than any command he had given that night. His eyes remained fixed on the small pendant resting against Lena's collarbone, but now he was no longer seeing it as an object. He was seeing it as a fragment. A piece of something unfinished that had followed him longer than he had ever admitted. The faint engraving, the worn edges, the quiet care with which it had been kept, it all began to align with something buried deep in his memory. Not clearly. Not completely. But enough to make his breath slow, measured, as if he were stepping carefully through something fragile. Lena watched him closely now, her posture steady but her attention sharpened. Whatever had started as a simple question had shifted into something she could not fully understand, but she could feel it. The change in him was not subtle anymore. It was quiet, controlled, but undeniable. "You remember something," she said softly, not as an accusation, but as an observation. Adrian's gaze lifted to meet hers again, and for the first time since this began, there was no edge in his expression. Only focus. "I remember, a night," he said slowly, each word deliberate, as if pulling it from a place he had not visited in years. The room seemed to lean in without moving, the quiet deepening as his voice continued. "It was years ago. Before everything became what it is now." He did not elaborate on what everything meant. He did not need to. The weight of it was already there. Lena did not interrupt. She simply listened. "I was not supposed to be there," Adrian continued, his gaze drifting slightly past her again, as if the memory was unfolding just beyond her shoulder. "Wrong place. Wrong time. Or maybe," he paused briefly, his jaw tightening just enough to show the thought had more layers than he was willing to say. "Maybe exactly the right place." Lena's fingers tightened slightly around the pendant again, not out of fear, but anticipation. Something inside her was beginning to connect as well, though she did not yet have the full picture. Adrian exhaled slowly, his voice lowering further. "There was a man," he said. "Not important to anyone who was watching. Just another face in the background." The words echoed what Lena had said earlier, but now they carried a different meaning. A deeper one. But he saw what others did not. And he stepped in, without hesitation. Adrian stopped there, not because the memory ended, but because the weight of it had finally reached the surface. His eyes returned to the necklace, sharper now, more certain. He wore something, Adrian added quietly. A chain. Simple. Nothing expensive. Lena's breath caught. Almost imperceptibly, but enough that the moment tightened between them. He used to, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's gaze snapped back to hers, and this time, there was no distance in it. No separation between past and present. Just realization, forming piece by piece. I never knew his name, Adrian said, his voice steady but heavier now. He did not stay. He did not ask for anything. He stopped again, the sentence unfinished, because the ending no longer belonged to memory. It belonged to the present. Lena's hand rested fully over the pendant now, holding it as if it had suddenly become something more than a memory. Something alive between them. The restaurant, the people, the quiet tension around them, it all faded into the background. Because in that moment, two timelines had begun to overlap. And neither of them could pretend it was coincidence anymore. The realization did not arrive all at once, but when it did, it settled with a quiet certainty that neither of them could ignore. Adrian's gaze held Lena's now, not with authority, not with expectation, but with something far more rare for a man like him. Recognition. Not of her, not yet, but of the connection that had just been uncovered between them. His voice, when he spoke again, had changed. It no longer carried the weight of control. It carried memory. He said something, Adrian murmured, more to himself than to her at first. Before he walked away. Lena's fingers tightened around the pendant, her breathing slowing as if she already knew what might come next. What did he say? She asked, her voice softer than before, but steady. Adrian did not answer immediately. His eyes drifted downward again, not to the necklace this time, but somewhere deeper, somewhere internal. Then, slowly, he spoke. He said, "Take care of what matters. The rest will figure itself out." The words landed gently in the air between them, but their impact was anything but light. Lena's eyes widened just slightly, the smallest shift, but enough to change everything. Because she had heard those words before. Not once. Not in passing. But over and over again, spoken in a voice she knew. Better than her own thoughts. He used to say that, Lena whispered, almost to herself, her voice carrying something fragile now. All the time. Adrian looked up at her sharply, and in that moment, whatever distance had existed between them disappeared completely. There was no doubt left. No space for uncertainty. The man from his past, the one he had never been able to name, the one who had stepped in when no one else did, had a name now. And that name stood in front of him in a different form. Lena's hand moved instinctively, lifting the pendant slightly, turning it so the engraving caught the light once more. "The initials," she said quietly. "MB." Adrian stepped closer, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with a kind of gravity that pulled him forward. His eyes locked onto the faint letters, and this time, there was no hesitation in his recognition. His hand rose slowly, stopping just short of the pendant, as if even the air between them held significance now. "Marcus Brooks," he said, the name no longer uncertain, no longer distant. Lena nodded, her eyes never leaving his. The room around them remained silent, but it was no longer tense in the same way. It was witnessing something. Something rare. Something that could not be undone. Adrian's hand lowered again, but not because he had lost interest. Because he understood now that this was not something to take. It was something to respect. He exhaled slowly, his posture shifting once more, not in dominance, but in acknowledgment. "He changed my life," Adrian said quietly, the admission simple, but heavier than anything else he had spoken that night. Lena did not respond right away. She studied him, not as a waitress looking at a powerful man, but as a daughter looking at someone who carried a piece of her father's story. He never talked about it, she said finally. Adrian nodded once, understanding that more than she might realize. He would not, Adrian replied. Men like him, they do not do things to be remembered. A pause followed, deeper than any before it. Lena's grip on the pendant softened slightly, her expression shifting into something quieter, something that carried both pride and absence at the same time. Adrian looked at her for a long moment, truly looked at her, not as someone passing through his world, but as someone who had always been connected to it in a way he had never known. And in that moment, the question that had started everything no longer mattered. Because the answer had revealed something far greater than either of them had expected. Adrian did not move for several seconds after speaking those words, and in that stillness, something shifted in a way no one in the room could fully understand but everyone could feel. The man who had walked into the restaurant earlier that night, commanding attention without effort, now stood in quiet reflection, his focus no longer on control but on something far more rare. Recognition was only the beginning. What followed was something deeper. Lena watched him carefully, her posture still composed, but her eyes now searching his face with a different kind of awareness. This was no longer about a question. This was about meaning. About consequence. About something her father had done that had traveled further than she had ever imagined. He never talked about people he helped, Lena said softly, her voice carrying a quiet certainty. Not even once. Adrian nodded slowly, as if that detail completed something in his mind. He would not, he repeated again, but this time the words carried more weight. Because to him, it was not something worth telling. His gaze lowered briefly, then returned to her, more grounded now, more present. But it was everything to me. The room seemed to hold on to that sentence, the silence stretching just enough to let it settle. Around them, the restaurant had begun to move again, but only at the edges. A server quietly poured water at a distant table. Glassware shifted gently. Conversations resumed in low tones. But the center of the room remained untouched, as if something invisible had drawn a boundary no one wanted to cross. Lena's fingers loosened around the pendant, not letting go, but no longer holding it as tightly. There was something in Adrian's voice that changed the way she saw him. Not as a powerful man standing in front of her, but as someone who had carried a moment from her father for years without knowing where it came from. What happened that night, she asked, her voice careful, not demanding, but sincere. Adrian exhaled slowly, and for the first time, he did not seem like he was deciding what to say. He seemed like he was deciding how much to allow himself to remember. I was younger, he said. Not as careful. Not as controlled. His words were measured, but there was no hesitation now. Things went wrong. I misjudged a situation. And it could have cost me everything. He paused briefly, his gaze steady, but softer now. Your father did not ask questions. He did not hesitate. He saw what was happening, and he stepped in. Not because he had to. Because he chose to. Lena listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, but her attention unwavering. Adrian continued, his voice quieter now. He made sure I got out of that moment. And then he walked away before I could even thank him. A faint breath escaped him, almost a reflection of disbelief at the memory itself. I looked for him after. Tried to find out who he was. But there was nothing. No name. No trace. Just, gone. Lena lowered her gaze briefly, her fingers brushing over the pendant again, but this time the gesture carried something different. Not just memory. Pride. That sounds like him, she said softly. Adrian studied her for a long moment, the connection between them no longer abstract. It was real. Tangible. Built on something neither of them had planned but both could now feel. He straightened slightly, but not in the way he had earlier. There was no dominance in the movement. Only clarity. He did not ask for anything, Adrian said, more to himself than to her. And yet, everything I became after that moment traces back to him. The weight of that realization did not need to be explained. It was already there. Lena met his gaze again, her eyes steady, but there was something new in them now. Not just understanding. Recognition. Of the impact her father had made in a world she had never seen. And in that moment, the space between them no longer felt like distance. It felt like connection. Quiet. Unspoken. But undeniable. Adrian stood. Still after her words, and in that silence, something inside him settled with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. Everything he owned, controlled, and represented suddenly felt insignificant compared to the quiet truth standing before him, Lena Brooks, daughter of the man who had once changed everything. The room had returned to its rhythm, yet it felt distant, fading behind this moment. His gaze dropped to the necklace again, but now without tension or demand, only understanding, and when he lifted his hand, it stopped short before gently adjusting the twisted chain, careful and respectful, as if he knew it was not his to take but to honor. Lena didn't move, her eyes steady, her breath calm, and the fear that once filled the space was gone, replaced by something deeper. When his hand fell, the shift had already happened, not just within him, but between them. "You kept it safe," he said quietly, his voice stripped of sharpness. She nodded once, touching the pendant with quiet certainty. "I always will." Adrian studied her, then did something unexpected. He stepped back, not from disinterest, but from understanding that this moment belonged to respect, not control. That single step created a new space, and in it, everything changed. Those nearby noticed, confusion replacing tension, though they couldn't name what had happened, because it wasn't loud, it was quiet, and quiet moments carry the most weight. Adrian turned as if to leave, then paused, glancing back. "If you ever need anything," he said, simple words carrying something far deeper. Lena met his gaze, grounded. "I will be fine," she replied softly, not rejecting, not accepting, just stating her truth. He nodded, a faint, genuine smile touching his face before he walked away, unchanged on the surface, yet altered in a way no one could see. Lena lifted her tray again, calm and composed, but different, not because of him, but because of what had been revealed. The necklace rested as it always had, catching the light, yet now it held more than memory, it held connection. And as the night continued, voices rising and glasses clinking, one truth remained, quiet and undeniable: some people change your life without ever asking for recognition, and sometimes, years later, the world finds a way to remember them, and that night, without a word, dignity was not just preserved, it was seen.